Story 1. I was 9 when Dad began to crawl. I remember the summer had been a particularly long one, or at least it felt it, though the temperatures remained low well into June, and it seemed to get dark far earlier than it should have on account of the fogs that would roll in each afternoon to snuff the sunlight. I remember the unseasonable weather was the only topic of conversation among everyone in our town, but that was the same most years, and the weather being wrong is seemingly commonplace everywhere now. But that year had been especially off, memorably so, especially since it also brought us the September when Dad began to crawl. It wasn't as strange as it sounds, at least not to us. We grew to accept this new way of things quite readily. That was just something he did now. My dad was prone to change, though perhaps no more than anyone else outside of the madhouses. Sudden diets, interests and hobbies that disappeared as quickly as they'd begun, changes in style, the hat phase, famous to us, and he was in a habit of growing his hair long before shaving it all off and starting again, a little less growing back each time it came through. If you were to look through our family photographs, you'd be forgiven for thinking a different man assumed the role of Dad each year, and, figuratively speaking, you'd be right, he was difficult to know. Not because he was especially guarded. If anything, he was rather open and forthcoming for a man of his era, but because of his variability. It's not that he wasn't a genuine or earnest man. I very much think he was. All 12 of him. Whenever he appeared with a new look or hobby or deeply held conviction about something, it didn't seem to bother her much, which I suppose is a good thing. To this day, I feel a great deal of envy whenever friends or people I meet describe their dads, even if the characterizations are usually negative. Everyone seems to resent their dads, the drunks, the abusers. I don't remember there being a clear point in time where he stopped walking, but nor was it a gradual development. It was a shift straight from one way of things to the new way of things. Dad crawled now. When he moved around, he crawled on his hands and knees. Not like a dog. He crawled like a human adult male would crawl. If he needed to move fast, he'd arch up and use the balls of his feet to propel himself instead of his knees. Everything else was the same at first. He would now climb his way up to it if he could, and as far as any of us could tell, he still loved us just the same, and we loved him too. I don't remember there ever being a situation where I felt embarrassed by him, even when he'd go out and about in town like that. I was getting to the age where I was beginning to be embarrassed by a lot of things, and I'd even starting having my mum drop me off round the corner from school so nobody would see us together, for no good reason at all. My mum was a perfectly normal-looking woman who dressed normally, behaved normally, and drove a normal car. I don't remember anyone mentioning it, no strange looks or loud whispering, and none of the kids at school ever brought it up. Even the ones who would routinely wield any reachable tool to degrade and humiliate me, to make me feel like less of a person than I was. In hindsight, it seems very odd that my crawling dad barely raised a glance, though I suppose it was not the oddest thing about that year. One thing that was nice, refreshing even, about my dad crawling was that it seemed to have stopped him developing new characteristic uncharacteristics. Once he'd gone down on all fours, he never found any new obsessions, never felt the need to change his appearance, never started exhibiting any new mannerisms or accents. It was as if all of that experimentation had just been a long process of discovery, trial and error, leading him towards his final form, his final truth, that he was meant to crawl the earth rather than walk it. We're more aware now than we were then that people are often ill-suited for their lot in life, whether genetic or environmental, and that the only chance at contentment for many involves altering some of these things by force. For my dad, it seemed, this was the thing he'd had to alter. He didn't ever seem particularly discontented while he was vertical, though I can't definitively say he was happy either. I suspect the hobbies and other attempts at transformation would frustrate him when they didn't work as he'd hoped they would, and you could sense a certain lowness about him when this happened. Each phase would have a honeymoon period lasting no more than a week or two, before he'd either start to sway, gradually reintroducing prohibited foods, for instance, or outright change course quite suddenly, the shift from standard Protestantism to a kind of mystic scientism. Come to think of it, one victim of all this constant shifting and twisting around might have been his. To have and care for a family, we were one of the few permanent results of a personality, a phase which involved him being a caring and devoted husband and father, and one which might have stood in the way of the drifts to come. When he fancied himself a writer or an inventor, I remember feeling more than ever that we were a hindrance rather than a blessing or a core component of his own identity. While he never expressed this outright, it was something we could all sense. And I think we only accepted it because we all knew that it wouldn't last very long before he adapted into something for which we were a welcome addition. In any event, whatever discontentment he may have experienced in the course of all these things dissipated entirely once he started crawling. He'd found his thing, and we were all glad for him. I don't think any of us thought much more than that of it until later, when the other dads started joining in. I remember being confused when grown-ups would be able to talk about life holistically, interpreting things from the past and extrapolating into visions of the future. It might as well have been magic, and I suppose in many instances it is like magic, or at least appears to have the same rate of failure as any other nebulous, esoteric form of divination, and though I believe I am able to recount the events of that winter in a way which represents the truth of what they were and the implications they might have, I suppose I can't be sure either. All I can do is try to remember the least of what it was, something no one else seems fit or willing to do when it's brought up. Our town was a family town, in the sense that people between the ages of about 18 and 35 didn't really exist there. You were either a kid or a parent or a grandparent. The kids would often leave as soon as they were able, and stay gone until they were old enough to come back with a family. Who could blame them? There were precisely 0 avenues or establishments in the town itself where you weren't under the constant glance of sensible adults. As such, we were forced to develop and explore our independence out in the insecurity of wilds that immediately surrounded the town. Scattered throughout the woodland were gravel pits, disused shacks, and abandoned vehicles. The woods were our town, we made it ours. Indeed, so complete a microcosm of society it became, its own machinations, rules, and class systems were organically and spontaneously established. Certain landmarks held functions, and there were areas which were de facto off-limits to those in the wrong circles. You knew, for instance, never to hang around the burned-out camper van if you weren't one of the Delaney brothers' crew. For kids my age, anywhere north of the mile-long creek which ran through the densest part of the forest and whose water was discovered to be the source of the unusual prevalence of ocular cancer in the town's children was unfriendly territory. That was the arena in which the activity of older kids would transpire: drugs, revenge, and nascent fumbling sex acts. I say this simply to emphasize that there were essentially 2 towns: the town proper, where all the grown-ups lived out their grown-up lives, and then the town outer, where all the kids went to grow up. Any man, any full-grown adult male in the town was a dad to at least one of the kids there, with minimal, insignificant exceptions. No need to expound upon the one childless man who briefly occupied the role of town librarian, or the childless male couple who lived together in the nice part of town. Neither were there long enough for it to matter, and your guess as to why they left is probably the correct one. Some dads occupied the sorts of roles you would expect of men in that sort of time, in that sort of town: mechanics, locksmiths, store managers, but most of them worked at the factory a couple of miles away. The factory, known only and always as the factory, was our town's industry. It was credited with seeing us through several recessions and economic upheavals relatively unscathed, and, as mentioned, with contaminating the creek that caused the unusual prevalence of ocular cancer in the town's children. In town, the factory was treated as unmoving and essential a thing as the air itself, even less prone to variance in fact. It sat just elevated enough that its lone grey turret could be seen from virtually any vantage point within the town or its surroundings. Although myself, and presumably most of the non-dad townsfolk, had never actually seen the entire building up close, it was sufficient to know that it was simply there, and it was there that most of the dads would go to work. I don't know what the factory was for, nor do I really know what my dad did there, from any discussion, form, or pay stub. The most I can discern is that he was a worker there. I never bothered to ask for any more detail than that, and he never offered any unbidden, like some dads might do. To him, it seemed, his job was just a minor inconvenience, a tedious and unimportant necessity to facilitate his true passions, whatever they may have been that week. But he never complained about it, and he never missed a day, even after he'd gone horizontal. As I said, my dad was the same dad he always was. If anything, he became even more the same once he'd started crawling. There was nothing else to him. Nothing new for us acclimate to. He just crawled around, went to work, played with us kids, and crawled into bed with his wife at the end of it. Only one time do I remember it occurring to me that there might be something wrong with this. At that age, and for as long as I can remember before it, I always slept with my bedroom door open, looking out onto the landing. I don't know if there was any particular reason for it, but I couldn't have it any other way. and if one of my parents closed the door after putting me to bed, I would always rush up to open it again. There was nothing I was actually scared of, yet it would send a cord of terror down my spine as soon as that door closed while I was in bed. One night, I'd woken up suddenly from what must have been a bad dream. One of those ones so terrible that your memory rejects them outright, and you're just left with the dread sensation that you had experienced a horror in sleep, and it might have followed you back out. The wind outside had been pummeling the trees, so the tendrils of their branches scratched against my window, adding sensory stimulation to my already overwhelmed juvenile limbic system. Instinctively, I did what I'd always done in this situation and cried out for my dad. I'm unsure why he was always my first choice to comfort me when I was frightened. On balance, I'd say I was definitely closer to my mother who, typically of the women in our town, had been much more present and involved in the key stages of my emotional upbringing, and certainly was my first port of call in any other emotional or physical state. But when it came to being frightened, it had to be Dad. Perhaps it was because I'd never seen him frightened by anything himself, and I knew he'd always come. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I heard the clumsy thump of limbs on their bedroom carpet, then the frantic patter of his hands slapping against the hardwood floor as he approached my door. It was then that I got the deep, distinct impression that something was wrong, deeper than the sensation whatever nightmare I'd had already stirred within me. The sound of my dad approaching, the sound that would typically comfort me in a state like this, was making me more terrified than I'd ever been. I don't have words fit to begin explaining how much I utterly dreaded seeing him crawl past the doorway and into my vision. I closed my eyes tight right as the slapping sounds of his palms whacking themselves against the floor came closer and then stopped. Silence now. He must have been outside my room, looking at me. I couldn't bear to open my eyes. I knew it was just Dad. I knew it would be the same Dad I saw every day. I was even used to Dad crawling. It never disturbed me in the slightest. But at that moment, I couldn't imagine anything more horrifying than what I knew I would see in that doorway if I were to open my eyes. He remained silent. I remained silent as well, stifling the sharp, panicked breaths that were trying to burst out of my chest. I wanted nothing more than to hear those same thumps and thwacks of limb upon wood retreating back to his bedroom. I couldn't explain nor rationalize it to myself. I simply wanted him gone. But still there was silence. For how long I could not say. Too long. My eyes instinctively wanted to open a little to see what was going on, but I forced them to remain firmly shut. I was locked in, suffused with the most primal physical fear I'd ever known up to that point, and remained that way until my eyes suddenly sprang open to reveal an empty room and an empty hallway, bathed in the morning light. The impact soon faded, as with any nightmare, and I was untroubled when Dad came crawling into the kitchen for breakfast. But to this day I won't sleep with my bedroom door even slightly ajar. By late October it had become commonplace for the other dads to crawl. As with my own, I remember this being neither sudden nor gradual. I'd first seen one dad crawling down the main street, a thermos clutched in his free hand, and simply not thought much of it. A couple of days after that, it occurred to me that everyone's dad had been crawling, as if it had always been that way. It was a development, but not one that struck anybody as strange, wrong, or frightening, nor did I credit my own dad with having started the trend. Soon after that, Dad became even more horizontal than he had been. He refused to assume any vertical orientation and would no longer climb upwards onto chairs or into bed. He requested that we serve his plates on the floor at meal times. My mum never disclosed much at the time, and she says even less about it now. But I would sometimes be woken by sounds from their bedroom at night. Strange sounds, not unnatural but rather too natural, sounds that I, as a child, could only imagine emanating from deep wilds or abattoirs. Eventually, Dad wouldn't even climb the stairs at night. I'd come down in the early morning to find him in the middle of the living room rug, prone like a sphinx, his eyes wide open, somehow even more open than when he was awake. Then he stopped sleeping entirely. By mid-November, the fog that had been descending daily from the woods became denser and permanent, and it became impossible to see more than 6 feet in front of you. Walking into town was akin to what I'd imagine walking through clouds to be like, with only blurry streetlights, lights and vague shapes and impressions to guide your way. More often than not, the shapes you'd see would be those of crawling beasts, skittering in and out of visibility, their details completely obscured by the deep murk that enshrouded us. Soon enough, the fog had become so heavy and pervasive that it seemed unwise to go out in it, and we all began to stay home. All of us, except the dads, that is. The dads would still leave their homes every morning as usual, on hand and foot. With nobody driving cars around town, it became their sole dominion to crawl. Nobody knew what they were doing and nobody asked. We assumed they weren't going to the factory, which was more than 2 miles away through the woodland, an unthinkable journey to crawl. But it didn't affect us, and I imagine if I'd had the forthrightness to ask questions, I would have squarely been told it was none of my business. In fairness, it wasn't any of my business. I would come to know that whatever business this was, it existed far beyond my remit. That the dads were doing what the dads were doing is about as close to certain as I can be on the matter, and as long as Dad came home, I had no reason to concern myself with it any further. One evening, early December, Dad didn't come home. None of them did. They had left their houses that morning as usual, with no outward signifiers that this day would differ from any other, and they never returned. The following day, I remember accompanying my mum on a drive into the town's foggy moor to search for him, only to find all the other mums and kids doing the same thing, headlights scanning vainly for things long since gone. Even at that young age, I somehow knew, intuited at least, that my dad was never coming back. It took some of that growing and comprehending I mentioned before to realize that Dad had already been gone a while before that day the dads disappeared. The next day, the mums organized a search party, scouring the woods around the town for dads. I wasn't allowed to go, so my older sister was left with me at the house. I remember spending the entire day staring out of my bedroom window. The only thing I could see through the impermeable mist was the factory's turret, silent, unmoving in the distance, the only constant left. When Mum came back that evening, I heard sobs, harsh breaths, and the frantic exchange of hushed voices between her and my sister. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I sat hidden at the top of the stairs and tried my best to make out what had been discovered. My mum has never spoken about it again. Any of it, not my dad, not the crawling, not the fog, not the town, not the factory, not what they had found there. After corroborating with my sister, what I know is this. The mums had followed several trails, hand and footprints, coming from all different angles into the forest. Along these trails, they found articles of clothing, Dad's clothing, across the forest floor. Although the clothes hadn't simply been removed, they had been bifurcated precisely down the middle, as if carefully sliced off whatever was wearing them, and they were hot to the touch in spite of laying on the cold earth for at least a whole day. Gradually, the various trails of prints had begun to coalesce and meet in the middle, beyond the point they all met. About 1 mile south of the factory, they formed one single trail. One set of hand and footprints, the size of 70 men's put together, which crawled in a straight line directly to the factory. The very next morning we left town. I'd been woken up by Mum around dawn, who listlessly told me we were going and we wouldn't be coming back. I barely had time to fill a backpack with my things, let alone begin to comprehend the emotional weight of all that was happening and what it meant. Dad's possessions were left entirely untouched. I got the distinct impression that nobody would ever touch them again. As my mum listlessly drove the car through the last of the mist, which dissipated as soon as we had pushed through the town's surrounding woodland and broke free of its limits, she kept her eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. If at any point she had looked behind her, she would have seen the town swallowed whole by the fog, all except for the factory, which still stood tall in the far distance, glowing deep red from within, as if filled with an infinity of burning coals. Story 2. I've read that a body can take over a year to fully decompose, so I guess I'm just really good at it. Every single day, another piece of me seems to loosen or open up or fall off. I can't even scratch an itch anymore without losing chunks of flesh from the simple friction of my nails against my skin. I don't know how much longer I have, or what will happen when the final pieces of rot slide off my skeletal frame. Will I die? I'm already dead. At least I think I am. Will I still be conscious? Even when I'm nothing but a pile of slimy bones, unable to move or do anything at all. I deserve this. Last month I got off work and walked home like I always do, stopping at the pita shop that I stopped at every single day. I got my normal, but they fucked up my order and let me keep it anyway, so I had 2 gyros. It sounds stupid, but that genuinely felt like a shining piece of good luck, and I hardly ever get anything like that. So my day had gone from bland to absolutely glowing in an instant. The little things in life, right? On the walk home, there was a homeless guy on the street corner, leaned up against the brick wall. He didn't have a sign or anything, but he smelled bad. I could actually smell him from several dozen feet. It was like rotten eggs, and the closer I got, the worse it was. I tried my best to keep my distance from him, but of course the light changed as soon as I got to the crosswalk. and I had to stand there awkwardly as I waited for the walk sign to come back on. "You ain't gonna eat all that." At first I didn't even know he was talking to me. His voice sounded closer than he was sitting, so I looked over my shoulders to try and figure out who was speaking. He was the only person near me, and he asked me again. His voice was gravely, and he had a southern accent. I looked down at the bag of food in my hand, which was a brown paper bag, so he shouldn't have even known how much food was in it. I ignored him and turned to face the crosswalk again. But then he said it again. "You ain't gonna eat all that." His voice was louder, angrier, more direct. "It's for my girlfriend," I snapped back, lying to him. I honestly don't know why I lied. It's not like he could know what was even in the bag. I just felt like I had to defend myself in a strange way, like I owed the guy some explanation of why I wasn't giving him my food. Now, looking back on it, I think the messed up order was not a stroke of good luck. The lights changed and I almost ran across the street to get away from that man. I pushed it from my mind and tried to recapture the positivity that I had before the stranger spoke to me, but in my efforts to relax, I found myself absent-minded. I never saw it coming. I still don't even know what kind of car it was, but it felt like a bus. It hit me on my left side and my vision instantly went black. I couldn't see or hear, but I could feel. It was like every bone in my body was shattered into pieces, and the little shards stabbed into every part of me from beneath my flesh. I felt my feet get ripped from the asphalt. I felt my body weightless in the air before slamming back into the ground, wrapping itself around what I can only assume was a stopping or telephone pole. Nothing ceased, aside from my lack of vision and hearing. I was present. I could feel and think and realize. Every single minute that I laid there, I felt it. I felt the cold ground beneath me, the warmth of the blood leaving my body and pooling under me. I remember the way it felt when I was finally lifted up, the nearly coagulated blood sticking to me like tape being peeled. I remember the way my legs felt as they swayed back and forth, the way the arms held me up. I can't stress how long it took, from scraping me off the sidewalk to dumping me in that shallow grave. They carried me for what felt like hours, and every single minute I was trying to snap out of it and wake up, until I finally did. The first thing I remember was how cold I felt. The morning dew had glazed my flesh and almost frosted over. The coldness was numbness, though. So initially, the only part of my body I dared to move was my eyes. The moon, the trees above me, the stars. That was all that existed for a brief moment. That's all I could see. When I finally gained the courage to move, the pain started instantly. Every part of me was sharp and jagged, like the mere thought of movement was enough to paralyze me in pain. I lifted my head from the wet dirt and lifted my left arm. It was worse than it felt. The bone was entirely exposed, and the worms had already begun their grisly task. I never thought about seeing my own bones before, but the pain had overshadowed the shock of it all. I could see the details, the pores, the way the worms wriggled, and the slight tickle that they offered me to dull the burn of the wounds. The most fascinating part was that I could see, with my own eyes, where my wrist connected to my hand, as well as all the little veins and intricate structures that existed between the hard parts. When I gained the strength to lift my body from the earth, I realized just how bad my condition truly was. My body was caked in dirt and dried blood. Several bones were shattered, and I could feel them floating around like foreign objects beneath the skin. My first thought was just how lucky I was to have survived such a traumatic incident, but I didn't survive it. I carried myself on aching bones all the way back to my apartment. It was still so early that nobody was out and about. If they had been certain, they would have fainted at the sight of me. I went to my bathroom and looked into the mirror, and what stared back at me was not me, or it was less of me than I remembered. My skin was grey, almost green around the edges, like rotted meat laced with infection. The worms had already taken my left ear, which made sense because the left side of my body was covered in open wounds and protruding bone. I turned my head and looked at the festering hole where my ear once was, and I could see deep into it, the ivory color of bone just visible, my skull. I felt sick, my stomach turned and my head felt light and swimmy. The writhing worms had to go. So I turned on my shower head and detached it from the wall, spraying the open flesh with both of the knobs turned on as high as they could go. The sound of the maggots tapped against the shower floor like rain, and black and red gunk washed out of the cavities in my body. In less than 30 seconds, the dirt and the worms and the slime had clogged my shower drain. Before long, I was up to my ankles in a soup of rot and decay, a tarry black sludge that rippled with wriggling worms. No matter what I did or how much I scrubbed, more worms kept falling from the shattered arm. I felt so disgusted with myself that I could hardly breathe, scraping handfuls of the things off my body and into the putrid stew at my feet. Finally, after half an hour of spraying myself down, I had gotten what I thought was the last of them off me. But then I had the tub to contend with. I couldn't even see the drain anymore. The fluid was entirely opaque to the point that it was reflecting my own rotted visage back up to me. I kneeled down and reached where I knew the drain was and plunged my finger into it. A thick, paste-like substance swallowed my finger as I hooked and pulled. That telltale sound of the drain giving way echoed against the white shower walls. The swamp of decomposition began to swirl like a diseased tornado, clogging itself back up. Each time the flow of the drain stopped, I ripped another handful of disgust from the drain and tossed it onto the floor outside the tub. Eventually the bathtub drained, and I fell onto my back into it. I pressed both hands against my temples and tried as hard as I could to relax, but it was nearly impossible. Despite the fact that I had drained most of the water, the tub was still decorated in dark clumps of worms and dirt. My bathroom was entirely wrecked, but naturally I felt that there were more pressing matters at hand, so I forced myself out of the tub and into the kitchen and pulled my cell phone from the rot-covered jeans that I had hastily kicked off. The screen was shattered and the battery was dead, but it miraculously still worked well enough to see the dead battery icon. I plugged it in and waited. My first idea was to call the police, but naturally I hesitated because I wouldn't even know what to say. Then I thought of calling my doctor. The office opened early enough that he might have already been there. Again, though, I didn't know what to say or how to explain the situation that I was going through. Finally, the phone buzzed and the screen lit up. I was shocked to see dozens of missed calls and texts from just about every person that knew me. "Are you okay? I miss you. I hope you're safe." A week. I had been gone for a week, rotting in the shallow grave for a week, being food for worms for a week. A week. I felt like crying, but the tears didn't come. It was like my eyes were dry and tacky, like marbles, but I could still see clearly. I unlocked the phone with the passcode, already knowing that the facial recondition would falter at the sight of me. The first and only person I wanted to call was my girlfriend, Mercy. I went to my recent calls and clicked on her name. The phone rang, the muffled sound vibrating through my skull. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, she answered. "Baby, oh my God, where are you? We've been worried sick. The police have been looking for you all week." Her voice was the first moment of peace I'd felt all morning. It was soft and sweet, and I could literally hear how much she cared about me. It was like a warm hug, wrapping my entire body into a bundle and holding me until the rot washed away. I opened my mouth, eager to speak to her, but nothing came out. It was like the moment in a nightmare where you're so close to something but your hand doesn't quite reach it. The only noise that manifested from my throat was a stringy groan, so quiet and subtle that she probably heard nothing at all on the other line. "Baby?" she asked with a disappointed panic. I hung up, instantly, trying not to panic her more than I already have. Obviously, despite my inability to formulate words audibly, I still could type, so I texted her, "Please come over as soon as you can. We'll explain." As soon as my thumb tapped the send button, my stomach turned again. This time it was a different kind of ache, an empty ache, a hunger. It was debilitating, like the walls of my stomach closing in and constricting against itself. It was more painful than the wounds, more painful than the shattered bones in my broken limbs. My body curled like a shrimp's, shrinking in agony to reduce the otherworldly sting. I lumbered on awkwardly smashed legs to my refrigerator, grasping the handle and yanking the door open. I grabbed a plastic packet of shredded cheese and poured the contents into my mouth, shaking every piece out. I tore open a package of raw bacon and shoved each slice into my throat desperately. I hadn't eaten in a week, so I guess the hunger had finally caught up. After the bacon, I ripped open a carton of eggs and grabbed one whole, biting down on it like an apple. The sticky mess was repulsive in taste, but the hunger was so strong that I would have eaten anything. The pain hadn't subsided, though, not even for a moment. In fact, the hunger was growing. The food that I had swallowed seemed to cause a reaction inside me, like a cheap science fair experiment. An excruciating pain radiated from deep within me, and the contractions of my stomach pulsated, eventually sending everything that I had eaten back out. Every piece of raw bacon and cheese and eggshell sprayed again the refrigerator door. I looked down at the mess I had made and noticed that within the mixture were clumps of worms and bugs. The rot was far deeper than I'd originally suspected. Still, the hunger consumed me, so I went for more. grabbing a jar of olives and swallowing several whole, but it still didn't work. Everything that I put in me immediately came back out. It was like my body was rejecting sustenance. I staggered to my bed, still unmade from a week previous, and I curled up on top of the unkempt sheets, wrapping myself in the blankets that used to offer a tinge of comfort. I agonized there in the fetal position, trying with everything in me to ignore the rupturing feeling of my insides revolting against me. Then, from the other room, a knock. Mercy. I knew it was her. I knew her knock like the back of my hand, or at least when my hand still had a back to it. The mere thought of her ceased the ache, as if love was the cure for my ailment. She always made me feel that way, despite us only having dated for about 4 months before all of this. She knew me, she knew how to calm me, she knew how to save me. I lunged from my bed, leaving a greasy stain in my place. I ran to the door and grabbed the handle, pulling it open with more excitement than I'd felt since I died. There she was, standing in the doorframe in all her beauty. Her blonde hair was curled and bouncy. Her makeup was immaculate. I assumed she must have just gotten ready for work before I disturbed her. Her blue eyes ripped the pain from my flesh like Novocaine, but her smile wasn't there. No, instead, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her skin was pale and clammy, her mouth open in fear. I could see the slight give in her knees as she looked at me, like she might have fainted before catching herself at the last minute. I tried to say her name. I tried to tell her how much I love her. But when I tried to speak, a mass of worms and raw meat regurgitated from my mouth and onto the floor in front of her. She screamed. I didn't know what to do, but my instincts took over. I grabbed her by her shoulders and pulled her into my apartment, slamming the door behind her. The whole reason I called her was to avoid the attention of the police or doctors or other strangers. She's the only one I wanted to speak to. She tried to back away from me, but her foot landed on a clod of meat and bugs and she slipped. I heard her head hit the corner of the kitchen island, a loud cracking sound that I could feel in my bones. Despite the incessant pain I was feeling, I just knew that had to hurt. She was dazed but still mostly conscious. I reached for her to comfort her, wanting to hold her, but she kicked me in the stomach and I stumbled back. Despite her fall, she managed to climb back to her feet and she grabbed a long knife out of the knife block on the island. I couldn't believe she wanted to hurt me, especially after all I'd been through. I thought she'd be excited to know I was okay. Before I could react, she plunged the knife into my chest. It hurt badly, but the pain had been dulled and numbed by the plethora of other wounds that had covered my entire frame. She let go of the knife and I stumbled back further, my back hitting against the door. In that moment, like something entirely new came over me. The hunger returned. The very same hunger that had driven me to devour an entire fridge of raw food had gripped me again, but it was clearer. I knew what I needed to consume. I loved that girl more than anything, but the feeling in my stomach was far stronger than the feeling in my heart. She ran toward the bathroom and I chased after her. She got inside before me and slammed the door, but my hand had just entered the threshold as well. The heavy door crashed against the fingers on my right hand, severing them like a guillotine. She screamed from inside the bathroom, but the hunger had drowned out any sense of feeling inside me. I kicked the door once and the cheap knob gave way nearly instantly, breaking and clanking against the bathroom floor. She was on the ground, looking up at me. My mouth watered, or at least it felt like it did, but I doubt saliva was present. Without thinking, I pulled the knife from my chest and turned toward her. She was scared, but I was hungry, and that came first. She put her arms over her head to block the blade, but I stabbed and stabbed and stabbed. It didn't take long until she stopped moving, maybe 50 or 60 stabs. As soon as the life escaped her eyes, I couldn't resist the hunger and indulged. My teeth sunk into the flesh of her throat, just above her collarbone. The taste of her skin was intoxicating, so I closed my jaw and ripped. I kept shearing chunks of her flesh off with my teeth until her head was entirely separated from her shoulders, and only then did the pain of hunger subside. I looked down at her, covered in crimson and segmented like a twisted puzzle. She was still beautiful. It felt poetic. I loved her so much, and now she was inside me, a little piece of her to follow me around wherever I go. It felt warm and comforting. I was glad she showed up. I stayed inside the apartment for several days, only visiting Mercy's remains when the hunger came. The pain of the rot on my own body grew with each passing day. The open flesh felt like a cold sore or a fever blister, but even more intense. Like the edges were tender and hot with a stinging kind of pain, like salt in a wound. Every part of me weeped with discolored discharge. I was, and still am, walking rot. At one point I noticed that the wound from the knife was sort of peeling. like the punctured skin had flayed open slightly, and my curiosity took over. I pinched the edge of skin, like the corner of a paper, and pulled it. A long, thick sliver of flesh peeled from my torso, like a cuticle that hangs on too long. I can't leave this apartment, I know I can't. If anyone were to see me, they'd take me away somewhere, so I've resorted to rotting here for the foreseeable future, scrolling around on the internet to pass the time. I still don't know what happens when the rot finally takes me, but I suppose I'll find out soon enough. Oh, and before I go, I almost forgot to mention another little detail. When I went into the bathroom for another meal, I noticed the strangest thing. There was a note laying on top of what was left of Mercy, which was incredibly strange because I didn't write it and nobody had come into my apartment. I unfolded it and read it to myself. "You ain't gonna eat all that." Story 3. I don't know if writing this is a good idea. I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times, and every single time I come to the same conclusion. Telling people will just make me sound crazy, but the alternative, keeping it locked inside me forever, feels like it's starting to corrode me from the inside out. It's been 25 years, and I'm afraid I'm starting to forget the details that matter, and worse, I'm afraid I'm starting to be pulled back. My name is Emma. I'm 34 years old. I have a decent job in accounting, a small apartment in the city, and what most people would consider a very normal, very boring life. I like it that way. I've worked hard for boring. But for the past few months, the nightmares have come back. They're always the same. I'm standing in a field of wheat, the stalks taller than I am, golden and dry under a searingly white sun. The air is dead still, not a single breeze. And in the distance, I can see the house, the old farmhouse. My childhood home. I know in the dream, with a certainty that freezes my blood, that I have to go back inside. I always wake up just as my hand touches the peeling paint of the front door. I'm writing this because the pull isn't just in my dreams anymore. It's a waking urge, a constant hum in the back of my mind. A little voice that tells me I need to go back to that house in rural Kansas. I need to see it one more time. I feel like if I don't, something terrible will happen. But I feel like if I do, it'll be even worse. So, I'm making a record, just in case. If I go, and I don't come back, I want someone to know why. I want someone to know what happened in that house. I was born there, lived there until I was 16 with my mother. My father was never in the picture. Mom said he was a brief and regrettable chapter, and that was the end of it. It was always just the two of us, and the house. It was a classic American farmhouse, 2 stories with a wraparound porch and white paint that had been surrendering to the elements for decades. It stood alone on 100 acres of land, most of it wheat fields that my mum leased to a bigger commercial farm. Our closest neighbor was 2 miles down a gravel road. The isolation was absolute. At night, the only light came from our windows and the moon. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the eaves and the chirping of a million cicadas. Even as a very little kid, I knew something was wrong with the house. It wasn't just the normal childhood fears of monsters under the bed, though I had those too. It was something deeper, a feeling, like the air was thicker in certain rooms, like the shadows in the corners of your eyes weren't just tricks of the light. I used to think the house was breathing. I could feel a slow, ancient rhythm in the floorboards, a quiet exhale in the sigh of the settling foundation. Looking back now, as a well-adjusted, rational adult, I try to explain it away. The house was old and big, and I was a lonely kid with an overactive imagination. Of course I was scared. The long, dark hallway upstairs was a terrifying gauntlet to get to the bathroom at night. The cellar, with its damp, earthy smell and single dangling light bulb, felt like the mouth to another world normal stuff, right? But then I remembered the specifics, and the rationality crumbles. I remember sitting in the living room, playing with my dolls, and hearing a floorboard creak in the empty bedroom directly above me, a slow, heavy sound, like someone was pacing. I'd freeze, my heart pounding in my tiny chest, and listen. 1 step, a long pause, another step. My mum would be in the kitchen, humming to herself as she cooked, oblivious. I'd run to her, and she'd tell me it was just the house settling. Houses make noises, Emma Bear, but it didn't sound like settling. It sounded deliberate. It all came to a head the summer I turned 9. That was the summer things went from vaguely unsettling to concretely, undeniably terrifying. That was the summer my mum got a roommate. It started on a Tuesday morning in July. The heat was already thick and suffocating, the kind that makes the air shimmer above the gravel road. I was in the kitchen, eating a bowl of cereal, watching my mom make pancakes. She was humming, same as always, a tune I didn't recognize. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was wearing her favorite floral apron over a simple t-shirt and jeans. I remember thinking how pretty she was, how the morning sun coming through the window made her look like an angel. "More juice, sweetie?" she asked, turning to smile at me. Her smile was the safest thing in the world. "No, thank you," I said, my mouth full of soggy cornflakes. I finished my cereal, put the bowl in the sink, and went to the living room to watch cartoons. The television was in the corner, an old boxy thing with rabbit ear antennas. I fiddled with them until the picture was mostly clear, then plopped down on the braided rug. A few minutes passed. Then I heard my mom's voice from the doorway. "Pancakes are ready, Emma Bear." I turned, and my blood went cold. My mum was standing in the archway between the living room and the dining room. She was wearing her floral apron, her hair was in a messy bun. She was smiling her safe, familiar smile. I was paralyzed for a second. My 9-year-old brain was trying to connect two pieces of information that simply didn't fit. "But you were just in the kitchen," I stammered. She tilted her head, her smile faltering slightly into a look of confusion. "No, honey. I've been upstairs making the beds. Come on, they'll get cold." My heart hammered against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Before I could say another word, my other mom, the mom I had just seen at the stove, walked in from the kitchen, holding a plate of pancakes. "Here we are," she said cheerfully, "fresh off the griddle." She stopped when she saw the mom in the doorway. The two of them stood there for a moment, looking at each other. Neither one seemed surprised, neither one seemed scared. The one with the pancakes just smiled, a little wider this time. "Oh, good," she said. "You can help me set the table." I couldn't breathe. They were identical, perfectly, flawlessly identical. Same height, same build, same faded t-shirt, same worn-out jeans, same little mole just above the left eyebrow. They moved into the kitchen together, their movements fluid and coordinated, as if they'd been doing this their entire lives. I stayed on the floor, hidden from their view by the big floral armchair. I was shaking. My mind was screaming, "This isn't real. This is a dream. Wake up, wake up." But I didn't wake up. I sat there and listened to them in the kitchen. I heard two sets of footsteps on the linoleum, two identical voices chatting about the weather, about needing to mow the lawn. I heard the clink of two sets of plates being set on the table, two sets of forks, two knives. Eventually one of them called for me. "Emma, breakfast." I forced my legs to move. I walked into the kitchen on shaky limbs. They were both sitting at the small wooden table, a plate of pancakes in front of each of them, and a third plate waiting for me. They both looked up at me and smiled, the exact same smile, at the exact same time. "There you are, sleepyhead," said the one on the left. "We were about to send out a search party," said the one on the right. I stared at them, my mouth hanging open. I pointed a trembling finger from one to the other. Why are there two of you?" I whispered. They looked at each other, then back at me. They chuckled. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was a warm, motherly laugh, but hearing it in perfect, overlapping unison made my skin crawl. "Oh, Emma Bear," said left mum, "what a silly question." "You have such a wonderful imagination," said right mum, reaching out to ruffle my hair. I flinched away from her touch. They acted as if everything was normal. They pushed the plate towards my empty chair, and when I didn't move, they just started eating, continuing their placid conversation. I couldn't eat. I couldn't speak. I just stood there and watched as my world fractured into a million pieces. I spent the rest of the day in my room trying to make sense of it. I kept expecting to wake up, or for one of them to disappear, for the prank or the dream or whatever this was to be over. It never was. For the next few weeks, I lived with two mothers. They were inseparable. They finished each other's sentences. They'd be in different rooms and start humming the same tune simultaneously. They cooked together, cleaned together, gardened together. They shared everything, even a bed. Our house only had 2 bedrooms, mine and my mum's. I'd hear them at night through the thin walls, whispering and laughing together before falling silent. It was a perfectly mirrored, perfectly synchronized life, and I was the only one who saw it as a nightmare. My every attempt to address the situation was met with gentle, patronizing dismissal. "Which one of you is my real mum?" I'd ask, my voice small and pleading. "We're both your real mum, sweetie," one of them would say, not missing a beat as she folded laundry. "But you can't be," I'd insist, tears welling in my eyes. One of you has to be fake. They would stop what they were doing and kneel down to my level. Two identical pairs of concerned blue eyes would fix on me. It sounds like someone is feeling a little left out, one would coo. Do you need some extra snuggle time today? The other would ask. They were gaslighting a 9-year-old child, and they were experts at it. After a while, I stopped asking. It was useless. It was like shouting at a brick wall that smiled and offered you cookies. I tried to find differences between them. A freckle, a scar, a habit. There were none. They were perfect copies. I took to calling them the original and the other, but I secretly had no idea which was which. The idyllic, creepy harmony of it all started to fray about a month in. One of them began to act, strangely, or stranger than the baseline of existing as a duplicate of my mother. It was the other. I decided one of them had to be the other, and I picked the one who now seemed slightly out of sync. It was tiny things at first. The original would be reading in the living room, and the other would be in the kitchen, just standing by the sink, staring out the window at the endless wheat, for minutes on end, completely still. Or I'd see the other in the garden, holding a trowel but not digging, just watching the bees move from flower to flower with an intensity that was unsettling. Then she started watching me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with that feeling you get, the one that tells you you're not alone. My heart would pound, and I'd slowly, carefully open my eyes, in the faint moonlight filtering through my window. I'd see her, standing in my open doorway, perfectly still, just a silhouette. She never came in, she never said anything, she just stood there and watched me sleep. I'd squeeze my eyes shut and pretend to be asleep, my body rigid with terror, until I heard the faint creak of the floorboards as she moved away. This happened almost every night. I started wedging a chair under my doorknob, but in the morning, the chair would be back in its spot by my desk, and the door would be slightly ajar. I tried to tell the original. I cornered her one afternoon when the other was outside, staring at the wheat fields again. "Mum," I whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "The other one, she watches me sleep." The original put her book down. The smile she gave me didn't have any warmth in it. It was thin and tight. "We're just making sure you're safe. Emma Bear, there's nothing to be afraid of." Her response terrified me more than the watching itself. It meant she knew. It meant they were in on it together. I was completely and utterly alone in this. The climax arrived on a hot, stormy night in late August. A classic Kansas thunderstorm was rolling in, the kind where the sky turns a sickly green and the air tastes like electricity. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window frames. I was in bed, covers pulled up to my chin, listening to the thunder grumble in the distance. I'd wedged the chair under the doorknob, a futile, pathetic ritual. Around midnight, a deafening crack of thunder shook the entire house. It sounded like the sky was being ripped in half right above us. The power flickered, then died, plunging my room into absolute darkness. I cried out, a small yelp of fear. Then I heard it, a noise from downstairs. It wasn't the storm. It was a sound I'd never heard before, and hope I never hear again. It was a wet, tearing sound, a thick, gulping, slurping noise. My fear of the dark was suddenly replaced by a much more primal, specific terror. I had to know what that sound was. I crept out of bed, my feet silent on the old wooden floor. I removed the chair from the doorknob, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get a grip. I crept down the hall, every creak of the house magnified by the storm outside. The sound was coming from the living room. It was louder now, accompanied by a low, vibrating hum. I peeked around the corner of the doorway, my body hidden, only my left eye visible. The living room was lit in frantic, strobing flashes from the lightning outside. Flash. The first thing I saw was the original. She was standing in the middle of the room, her back to me. She was perfectly still. Flash. The second thing I saw was the other. She was on her knees on the floor in front of the original. Her head was tilted back, her mouth open in a silent O. But her face, it was blurry, shimmering, like a heat haze on a summer road. Flash. The original's hands were on the other's shoulders, but they were sinking in, not like into flesh, but like pushing your hands into a bucket of thick mud. Tendrils of the other, of her hair, the fabric of her t-shirt, her very skin, were snaking upwards like smoke in reverse. They were flowing into the original's mouth and nose. Flash. The gulping, slurping sound was coming from the original. She was absorbing the other, swallowing her whole. The other was dissolving, her form becoming less and less distinct with every lightning strike, a river of shimmering matter flowing upwards. Her nightgown rippled and sank into the skin of the woman who was devouring her. She made no sound, no scream, no struggle. There was just the storm and that terrible wet noise of consumption. I was frozen. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, I could only watch the horror in stroboscopic snapshots. Flash. The other was almost gone, just a pair of legs, flickering and transparent. Flash. Only her feet remained on the rug. Flash. There was only one woman in the room. My mother. She stood there for a long moment, her whole body vibrating with that low hum. Then, slowly, she turned around. In the next flash of lightning, she looked directly at me. Her face was pale, her cheeks wet with tears, but her eyes were glowing with a triumphant, terrifying light. She saw me. I know she did. Then the light in her eyes faded, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. The hum stopped. She blinked as if waking from a dream. The next thunderclap finally broke my paralysis. I turned and scrambled back to my room, silent as a mouse, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I got into bed and pulled the covers over my head, and I did not move until the sun came up. The next morning, the power was still out. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright. I crept downstairs, my stomach in knots. My mother was in the kitchen, lighting the gas stove with a match. There was only one of her. She was humming that same tune, wearing her floral apron. "Morning, Emma Bear," she said cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. "I'm making pancakes." I stared at her, at the empty space where the other one should have been. The kitchen felt impossibly large and quiet. "Where is she?" I whispered. My mother stopped what she was doing. She turned to me, her face a perfect mask of confusion. "Where is who, sweetie?" "The other one," I said, my voice shaking. "The other mum." Her expression hardened. It was the quickest, most terrifying shift in mood I've ever witnessed. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and sharp. "Emma," she said, her voice low and firm, "we do not talk about our bad dreams at the breakfast table. It's impolite." And that was it. She never spoke of it again. We never spoke of it again. The subject was forbidden. Any time I tried to bring it up, she would get that same cold look in her eye and change the subject. Life went on. We were just Emma and Mom again, but the question has haunted me every single day since. Which one survived? Did I end up with the original? Or did I spend the rest of my childhood with the other, the thing that watched me sleep and then consumed her double in the middle of a thunderstorm? Is the woman I call my mother at all, or is she a copy that won? That's the question that has brought the nightmares back. That's the question that's pulling me back to that house. Mum sold it years ago, after I moved out for college. She lives in a retirement community in Arizona now. She's old and frail, and still refuses to ever talk about that summer. The house is empty. Some real estate company owns the land now, but they've never torn the house down. It just sits there, surrounded by wheat, waiting. I feel like the answer is in there. I know it's crazy. I know it's probably dangerous, but I have to go back. I have to know. So I'm asking you. I'm a stranger on the internet, and I sound like I've lost my mind, I know. But if you believe even a tiny piece of this, what should I do? Should I go? Should I just try to forget again and live with the nightmares? What would you do if you were me? Story 4. I was hired here about a year ago, and I work full-time, roughly 40 hours a week. I'm in college and take all of my classes online. It's convenient because I'm allowed to do homework while on the clock. I just have to be mindful of any customers. That is, if we had customers. Nobody really shops here, aside from the handful of regulars who come in every day, or at least once a week, and the random new person who will come in once, look around for a bit, and then never come back. I can't blame them. It's a pretty boring place to shop. I can also see how running into any of us, the employees, may be confusing or even off-putting to a person who has never been in here before. For some reason, we are required to wear a disguise, and it can't be the same one each time. Every shift, the disguise has to be different. It doesn't have to be anything specific, expensive, or elaborate. We just have to be fully covered. We are not allowed to talk about anything regarding our personal lives or use our real names. We have name tags, but they all have simple titles for what each person mainly does around the store. Because I'm usually dusting, my name tag says Duster. That's why my co-workers call me Dusty for short. I don't know how many of us are employed here, but I do know a few for sure. Normally 2 people are on the clock at the same time. Because I'm here every day except for Thursdays and Sundays, I get to work with someone different each time. My favorite, however, is a woman whose tag says cover cleaner. I like to call her CC. From the way her voice sounds when she speaks and some of the terminology she uses, I concluded she's likely around my age, if not a couple of years older. She's always wearing a mask that covers her whole face. She makes them herself as a hobby, which I think is a pretty creative way of dealing with the dress code. Cleaning is very important here, as the owners like to keep a clean space. That, and there is little to nothing better to do around here. While I tend to spend most of my time dusting the shelves, CC carefully wipes down the book covers and places them back onto the shelf, leaving them to be reorganized alphabetically by organizer. Oggy for short. I work with him on Tuesdays. He must be an older man, because his voice is coarse and sounds elderly. His back is hunched, and he grumbles a lot too. As the title says, there are no children allowed in the bookstore, which is odd because we do carry children's books and even have a play section. Some of us have speculated that the rule was implemented a while ago, but the place was never renovated, so the kiddie space remains sitting and collecting dust, while the rest of the store looks spick and span, as always. I mentioned before that's how the owners like it. I've only met one of them, but apparently there are 2 others. The one who usually takes care of hiring and public affairs likes to come in every now and then to check on the store. He refers to himself as Mr. Keys, I assume because he has a habit of swinging his keychain around his finger. Mr. Keys is, as some would say, a character. He never announces himself when he decides to drop by, but you'll always know it's him by the sound of his jingling keys. He comes wearing a ridiculously flamboyant disguise, matching his ridiculously flamboyant personality. He's quite tall, standing well over 6 feet, and slender as a twig. If I had to guess, he's likely in his late 20s, early 30s. He'll come in, greet whoever's working, and walk around the store. If something is not to his liking, he'll mention it right away, and whenever he leaves, he always says these parting words: "Do not let in any children, and remember to wear your disguises." I know I keep mentioning how boring my job is, but there was something strangely charming about the mundanity of the workplace. It contrasts so much with the bizarre yet short list of rules my co-workers and I must adhere to. In the time I've been employed here, I've never experienced nor witnessed the consequences of breaking one or more of the rules, as we are all careful not to. Not out of fear, but rather habit. Those who work here have all been employed for over a year, and for most, it's been way longer than that. There hasn't really been any need to hire anyone new after me, which is why I was surprised when Oggy informed me he would no longer be working Tuesdays because someone new had been hired. She came into the store in a full disguise and introduced herself as the new sander. She would be coming in once or twice a week to refurbish the shelves by freshly sanding all of them for the shelf stainer, Stan, whom I've only met a select number of times since he often works on the days I'm off. I'm not sure why he wasn't the one appointed to train the new girl, as if there was much to train her on, but their individual tasks just seemed to line up more, so I wondered about that. I called her Sandy, which she was okay with, and after taking a few minutes to go over the other rules with her, we got to work. The operating hours for the store are between 3 a.m. to 6 p.m, oddly specific, but it never mattered to me because I've always struggled to keep a healthy sleeping schedule. I prefer to work the opening shifts, and this was no different than any other early morning. I was dusting the shelves so Sandy could start sanding them to prepare for staining. After a couple of hours, I told her I would be taking one of my allotted breaks. I returned to the sound of the old telephone ringing. That's another rule, no personal devices either, so we have to use a retro telephone. I've heard people complain about this, wondering why we can't at least have a landline, but it's nowhere near the hassle of having to figure out a new disguise to wear 5 days out of the week. I walked over to answer the phone, lifting it from the stand. Corner Palace of Knowledge, what will you be reading today? The little slogan is printed on the sign hanging outside the entrance, and we're supposed to use it as part of any greeting. The other end of the line was staticky, and I was afraid the phone was finally breaking down. That thing was ancient. Just as I went to hang up, a voice emerged from the depths of the static, one that sounded cold in its straightforwardness. "Good morning, Mr. Duster. We hope this message finds you well. You will have an extra task to do today. It is very important to be mindful and proceed with caution. It would appear Ms. Stander isn't feeling like someone else today." The static was cut, and a subtle monotone sound indicated that the other end of the line had gone dead. I hung up, confused and feeling disturbed. I decided to go check on Sandy. I walked around to the back of the store where we had been working, but she wasn't there. I continued around the store, calling her name when I heard what sounded like a pile of books hitting the floor. I jumped and turned to find Sandy crouched down, carefully picking them up. "Oh, there you are. Sorry if I startled you. I didn't know where you went," I said, approaching her to help with the mess. As I got closer, I realized her hair was down. Her real hair. When she had come in, she was wearing a wig with some sort of head covering on, but she was no longer wearing either. "I'm sure I mentioned this, but we're not supposed to take off our disguises until we've either left the building or clocked out for the day. Company policy, I guess," I explained. Sandy stood up, her back still facing me. "I'm sorry, it's my first day. Please don't be mad," she said. Her voice was dry, and she spoke flatly. This reinforced my confusion and put me further on edge. "Are you feeling all right? You sound a bit odd," I said, hoping she might just be coming down with a cold or something. "I feel amazing," she exclaimed, her voice sounding overly animated and pitched up. This caused me to take a step back. "Are you messing with me? 'Cause this isn't funny. We should get back to work," I said firmly. She was unresponsive, standing completely still, until a moment later when she withered down to the floor and began crawling away on all fours. "Try and catch me," she called excitedly, scurrying away. "Hey!" I yelled as I gave chase. I ended up losing sight of her as she disappeared in the dark corners of the store, zigzagging around the mountains of shelves lined to the brim with books. I stood beneath the bright lights, calling Sandy's name and telling her to knock it off and quit the gag already. I heard nothing for several minutes and was too scared to go looking for her again when I heard the sound of childish laughter. Except there were no children, only a full-grown woman doing her best imitation of a little girl's laughter. I followed the sound and was led to the abandoned play section, where Sandy was sitting on the floor obnoxiously giggling and clashing the old toys together. I wondered if she was having some sort of episode. Maybe she has a mental condition that the owners were not privy to before hiring her. I realized talking to her as an adult wasn't working, so I tried addressing her as a child. This actually worked, and she turned to face me. Her cheeks were bright red, and her eyes were big and ocean blue. She had the face of an adult, but the expression and even features of an infant. "Hey, Sandy, why don't we take a break and go finish our project? Then we can come back and play some more. Does that sound good?" I asked softly. Looking at this title, many would think I work at an NSFW costume store or some sort of adult-centered theme park for millennials who never really moved past their teen years. However, neither is the case. I actually work at a bookstore. Yes, a bookstore. It's called the Corner Palace of Knowledge, and it is, in fact, a large palace-looking structure that sits on the corner of the shopping district in a small town we few thousand residents occupy. She seemed to ponder my idea for a bit and responded with a resounding no. I furrowed my brow, but tried to remain calm and understanding. Never did I think I would have to gentle parent a co-worker I've only met today. "Oh, come on. It'll be fun, you'll see. You like sanding, remember?" I said, nodding my head. She crossed her arms and scowled at me. "No, no, 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 no!" she shouted. I stood back, becoming increasingly agitated. "Young lady, come do your work this instant," I said, raising my voice. Sandy looked at me for a moment before bursting into tears. She threw herself onto her back and started flailing around on the floor. Her face grew red as she thrashed her arms and kicked her legs in a full-blown tantrum. I stood in shock watching this unfold. This was way above my pay grade, and this might be the only job I've ever had that actually pays pretty well. I wanted to de-escalate the situation, but anything I said only seemed to make her tantrum worse. She began ripping out clumps of her hair, squealing and hiccuping like the way a baby cries, but with fully developed adult vocal cords. Her arms and legs were beginning to bruise from how aggressively she was slamming them repeatedly on the floor. She was gnashing her teeth, bits of tooth fragments flying from her mouth. She even bit off the tip of her tongue, spitting it out and bleeding from the mouth as she wailed. I was shaking like a leaf and not knowing what else to do. I ran back to the desk and called the emergency contact number left on a slip of paper taped to the bottom of the telephone. Sandy's agonizing cries made my own throat feel scratchy and caused my pulse to accelerate as I stood, waiting for someone to answer. I listened impatiently when my ears perked up at the sound of jingling keys coming from inside the store. "Mr. Keys," I said aloud. The lights flickered, and I heard a loud thud. I went to find Mr. keys when I tripped over something in the split second of total darkness that befell the store. I experienced vertigo as I picked myself back up. I turned to see what I had tripped on, my heart dropping at the sight. It was a body. The big light lingering above the desk came on, and I recognized it to be the body of a woman. She was completely naked, with the skin of her face having been peeled off. Her eyes, teeth, and hair were all missing as well. I gasped, covering my mouth with both hands, trying not to scream. Tears filled my eyes, my jaw tingled, and saliva built up in my mouth as I gagged. I stumbled back to the desk where I had the sudden realization that the cries coming from the play section hadn't yet ceased. They were as loud and as tormenting as ever. I don't remember losing consciousness, but I awoke with a painful throbbing in my skull. I gripped the counters with my hand as I pulled myself up off the floor for the second time and looked around. Mr. Keyes stood on the other side of the desk, spinning his keychain around his finger. "Oh, good. You're awake," he said. What happened? What the hell was all that about?" I asked, still holding on to some disbelief about the horrors I witnessed. Even through his disguise, I could see Mr. Keyes grinning ear to ear as usual. "It's been taken care of. You needn't worry about it any longer. Only concern yourself with your job here, Mr. Duster," he replied. "But what about Miss Sander? What happened to her?" I asked. Mr. Keyes stopped spinning his keychain. "She was terminated. Ms. Sander was unfit to work here and will not be returning." I looked down at the floor, past where Mr. Keyes stood. "And what about the body?" I asked, a looming realization creeping into my thoughts and running down my spine. Mr. Keyes tilted his head, clenching the keys in his hand. "I've already told you. It's been taken care of. You needn't worry about it any longer. Only concern yourself with your work," he said this time. His words sounded more like an order rather than a reassurance. I opened my mouth to speak, but he immediately held his hand up to my face. "No more questions, Mr. Duster. Finish your shift, then go home and rest," he said calmly as he turned and made for the door. "Oh, and of course," he began, the grin returning to his face as he twirled his keychain around his finger once more. "Do not let in any children and remember to wear your disguise."